So, 2 books into the Sherlock Holmes canon now, and we are 3 for 3 on dead dogs, 2 for 2 on dead culprits, and 2 for 2 on Sherlock Holmes only being present for half of the story. I guess props for consistency. This is our obligatory spoiler warning. This video is going to be discussing the details for Study in Scarlet and some other Sherlock Holmes works. While I will not spoil who the culprits of these mysteries are, I will be discussing other twists as well as the way that the stories are structured, which could spoil many aspects of the story. So if you really want to experience the classic mystery firsthand, guess you should have read it already. It's kind of been out like forever. You're just so late to the party here, man. I don't know what to tell you. I also recommend having watched my previous video discussing Hound of the Baskervilles for some context on my understanding of the canon up to this point, if you want to be entertained about my descent into madness. For those who want to follow along at home, I am using the Duke Classics ebook edition of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet. The ISBN will be in the description below. All of my quotations that I actually cite in this will be marked with percentage markers instead of pages, as ebook formatting is finicky at the best of times, so don't mind me there. In a way, it shouldn't be a surprise that Study in Scarlet, despite being the book that introduces the icon, the legend himself, features Holmes for about as much page time as Hound did, but somehow it still was. Arguably, it was more shocking here, despite the fact that I've already dipped my toes in and had some idea of what to expect now with Sherlock Holmes as an actual character from the original source material. Because, you see, I'd come to the understanding after reading Hound of the Baskervilles that, at the very least, Hound was just very Watson-centric, to the point that it felt very odd that he's labeled as a point-of-view character instead of as the full-on protagonist. And to an extent, I kind of thought that this was probably just a one-book phenomenon. I mean, there has to be a reason why Watson is labeled as just the framing POV character, and if it's in only one story that he serves as the protagonist, that would kind of make sense. But then we get to the book that starts it all, and we're still not seeing all that much of Holmes. I mean, hell, the entire first chapter is all about introducing us to Watson's backstory leading up to their first meeting. So I guess we're also 2 for 2 on chapters being titled Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and then focusing on Watson. Which is not to say that Scarlet is also Watson-centric. In this case, when Holmes drops off midway through the book, Watson also is gone for like the next 100 ebook pages. In fact, I'm going to make the argument here that Holmes leaving halfway through in Scarlet does more to characterize himself, as opposed to in Hound of the Baskervilles, where him not being there characterized Watson. I'd also make the argument that this disappearing act helps to serve the same purpose of Hound's disappearing act, which is that it creates this emotional connection between the reader and the case that we may not have gotten if this was solely through Sherlock's perspective. So, a little recap for those uncultured as I am. A Study in Scarlet is the first of the Sherlock Holmes canon, where Watson, an army medic who is sent to England after an injury in the line of duty, leaving him unable to serve, just needs a roommate because these rent prices are absolutely insane, and he has a fixed income and he can't afford them on his own, which, mood. Lo and behold, an old friend of Watson also knows a guy that needs a roommate, but this mystery guy, he's just super weird and people kind of don't really like him that much, though no one explains why. But Watson's desperate. It's you know what, can't be that bad, right? Enter mysterious roommate number 1, Sherlock Holmes, who happens to actually be quite a model roommate. Little strange, but they get along pretty well. And then little bit into living together, Watson finds a magazine article in their home one day, going over the use of deductive reasoning to determine everything you could possibly need to know about a person, which Watson calls, and I quote, ineffable twaddle, and says, "I've never read such rubbish in my life." Turns out, of course, that this article was written by Holmes, who is very invested in defending what is pretty much a summary of his life's work. So when a strange murder case comes up and the police come to Holmes for help, he asks Watson to come along and see what these theories are like in practice. So with all that set up, you may notice that there's kind of a problem with something like this in novel form, and it's one that's touched on a little bit in my Hound video. Because if Holmes here is supposed to be this genius detective who can piece tons of things together about a person with just a look, how can you as a writer stretch out the time it would take for him to solve the mystery at hand to fill the entire novella? And this is a problem that a lot of writers deal with when trying to write a genius character, but I think it's really interesting to go back and see how Doyle handles it, as Sherlock is arguably the most common character that writers would now draw on for such a thing to develop this archetype these days, because you have to like really thread the needle. You don't want things to be too easy because that's just kind of boring, but if it's too hard, then you lose the idea that maybe the character is a genius after all. In my Hound video, I say that this is why Watson has to be our protagonist for the story to work, because Watson has a chance of failing, so there's more tension, and it also allows the story to stretch out without you even really noticing. Holmes can't solve things too fast if he's not the one we're following. And if it's Watson's investigation, he'll slow things down by the nature of just not being the genius character. So by the time Holmes reappears at the end, we're already tying up loose ends, getting our epic climax, and it's all very seamless. In Scarlet, however, the problem is solved by just solving the mystery halfway through the book. Like literally, 52% of the way through, per my percentage tracker, the culprit for 2 murders is just caught, arrested, and this isn't like a midway through episode false alarm that could be considered a staple of this kind of genre. It's the correct answer, like first try. It's just done. We've solved the problem. Yay, no more murders. There's just no dragging this mystery out for longer than it needs to be in order to meet some obligatory word count. Instead, it's solved in a time frame that makes Sherlock seem impressive, but also seems practical for a character who's been hyped up in the way that he did. And it proves his theories right at the end of the day to Watson and the reader. And this is what I mean when I say that Holmes dropping off halfway through the story characterizes him. He's not gone for half of the book because he's not important. It's because he solved the problem. He doesn't need to be there any longer. And as I kind of started to dive into in my Hound video, Holmes as a character is driven at least primarily by solving the problem at hand. Once that's over, he's ready to move on to the next case. And he's gone just because he's just that good at applying deductive reasoning to his special interest of crime. Just crime of all kinds. But that does leave us with another 48% of the book to focus on, because, I mean, the mystery's over, and all the people who were involved are either arrested or dead. Doesn't seem like much else needs to happen, but we're still here. And in a way, there's still a lot of questions that haven't been answered by this point, ones that Holmes maybe won't care about in a week, but the rest of us curious little worms will. While the who did it is solved, and you can piece the idea of how it was done together from all the bits that we've gotten thus far, the reason as to why is still completely missing. And the why behind the crime is solved in the last chapter of Hound of the Baskervilles, when all the characters essentially force Holmes to talk about it. Scarlet, however, also takes a different approach here, in that it spends the entire back half of the book giving you the 20 years of backstory as to why the culprit chases 2 Mormons across Europe for the chance of playing poison Russian roulette and winning both times, with a little stabbing thrown in for variety. And while I could try to set up a nice, smooth transition into talking about how part 2 of Scarlet itself is written in a way that sets up a completely different tone for the story, and gets you incredibly invested in learning this long history, regardless of if you know the ending, or it could just do as the book does and cut to 20 years ago in the middle of the desert with 2 characters we've never met. It's a very jarring transition at the time, because you have the switch from culprit almost jumping out a window and then getting arrested to a man and a little girl that we have never met before slowly dying in the middle of the desert with no hope for rescue. Neither of them have had their names mentioned up to this point. They're neither the culprit nor either of the victims. The scene between the two of them is heavily focused on their inevitable fates, with the little girl at one point having to come to terms with the fact that the rest of her biological family is dead and that she is going to be seeing them in heaven. It's just this gut-wrenching deterioration of these two characters as we wait for them to die of starvation, dehydration, or heat stroke, probably all three at once, with the man doing the best that he can to prolong this little girl's life, even though we all know it's futile. But it's also very confusing because, well, what does any of that have to do with anything that's happening up to this point? As jarring as a transition as it is, I, at the very least as a reader personally, got very invested in these new characters, John and Lucy Ferrer, very quickly, despite us being over halfway through a story and the mystery we came for already being solved. But when, shock of all shocks, these two managed to survive and become a family for each other in the aftermath of this near-death experience, there's just this intense emotional connection to them. We see them bond and come so close to the end and manage to survive with just a little bit of luck at the end of that chapter in part 2. And John is even confronted on whether the child is his by his rescuers, and he has this powerful declaration of, "She's mine, 'cause I saved her. No man will take her from me." And it's just kind of like seeing that familial bond between the two of these characters who have been implied to have lost everything else but each other, and almost having lost each other in that sense. It's like one of like the fastest relationship dynamics I've seen form so tightly over the course of a narrative. And then the ending of this chapter also does something very, very important, and it's name drop the victims very casually to the point where you can almost miss it. It's like probably 2 pages away from the end of the chapter, and it's with that subtle little name drop that it feels like all the pieces are now clicked into place. Because the only reason that we're here, the only reason that we're seeing this now, is that the victims of the murders in the present day had to have done something to this man and girl who managed to survive this terrible situation, and we're going to be spending the back half of the story building up to what that thing was. And much like I hinted at earlier, this is where we have our emotional investment to the story. Because sure, it's fun to see Watson and Holmes prance around London investigating dead bodies and insulting cops, but there's something more to this story that has to make it as powerful as it is. And it's the motivation behind the case itself. We meet John and Lucy, and as a reader, I found it incredibly hard not to get attached to them as an unlikely family pairing that had built their relationship through a shared near-death experience. And as a writer, I can't help but see how it's that first chapter of part 2 that is holding this story together in a way that gives it its impact. Without this emotional core motivating the actions of the players involved in the book's present day, there's not much reason for us to care past getting the culprit locked up where he can die of heart problems in peace. Not only that, but the tense tone of the second half is retroactively giving more weight to the actions that happened before. Because sure, murder mysteries being solved by a weird consultant and his roommate is entertaining, but part 2 is reminding us that there's always a little more at stake than just being impressed by deductive reasoning. Part 2 gives us the characters who are affected by the actions, both before and after the murders actually take place, and it reframes some of the pieces that we had in new lights, leaving you just kind of wanting to stare at the wall for like 3 hours. I promise that's a good thing. The real thing that impresses me about this section, though, despite the dread in the pit of my stomach as I was reading, knowing that something had to go wrong for John and Lucy as more familiar names continue to be dropped, it's that there's a hope kind of in the corner of all of that as well. Again, we haven't seen these characters before the backstory starts. There's not even a mention of them. And while that first starts by knowing that something must have happened to make it so that they wouldn't be in the present, the acts of the backstory are just so far removed from the present day that there is a chance, just a small chance, that another twist is coming. Another last-minute change to the formula that makes us rethink how we view the culprit's cries for revenge. And it makes the ends of John and Lucy hurt just a little more when you spend the few more chapters with them rooting for their success, even though there are red death flags in every sense of the word attached to the two of them. From their first appearance, both they, and by extension the story itself, will straight up tell you that John and Lucy will die. They tell it to themselves, and they tell it to the reader that it's only a matter of time. Of course, the only problem with giving our culprit such an understandable, relatable motivation with a strong emotional attachment to the case that Holmes and Watson just don't have is maybe, especially in the day and age of brooding anti-heroes, that your reader might have more of a thing for the revenge-driven bad boy, and thus is rooting for your culprit instead of your hero detective. Which, detectives, maybe? I want to give Watson props and everything, but he doesn't get to do as much investigating. In this one, he's kind of just here because Holmes wanted to prove a point to a random roommate he got. I mean, you know what? It doesn't matter. What it does is that after all this, the book still has one more trick up its sleeve, and that's to let both the culprit and Holmes come out as winners. Holmes catches the bad guy. The tragic anti-hero murderer gets to die in prison knowing that his one last goal in life has been completed. The ex-Mormons that were really weird with women are very dead, and Watson gets a really popular book out of it. Everybody wins. Overall, though, we have this story where the only way to get the best understanding of one of our main character's skills is for him to not be present for half of the story because he's just that good to happen to do his job in really a timely fashion. But what also it does is allow the story to have time to breathe and develop and make an incredibly suspenseful second half where you watch the real characters affected have to live out the various tragedies that brought us to the book's presence, that give the case its meaning not just to the fictional people involved, but to the readers who got attached to them later. Once again, Doyle just proves that Holmes himself as a character is not what makes these stories the classics that they are. When we're 2 for 2 on stories functioning because they lack his presence, I think it's safe to say that there's going to be at least some other factors involved to what makes the canon as a whole as iconic as it is. Though, I'm seriously thinking that Doyle has like a thing against dogs, because I'm sorry, how do you kill 3 of them off in the span of maybe 300 pages total? I mean, in Hound of the Baskervilles, it was a little sad and kind of expected in the case of one of them, but what do you mean that Sherlock Holmes just uses a random dog as a test subject for pills he thinks are poisoned? And then, when the first one doesn't work, he gets so upset, almost has a total meltdown in front of, Watson and the police over it, and has just the most dramatic sigh of relief wash over him when the dog actually dies from the second one. I mean, who gets excited about the dog dying? I think at this point, the number one way to know that you're going to die in a Sherlock Holmes story is to be a dog of any kind at this point. None of them are safe. With all that out of the way, of course, it's time to start on the next book, The Sign of Four. I admittedly haven't heard as much about this one compared to some of the other stories that have been name dropped throughout the years, but I mean, so far they've all been a good time all around, so I'm very much looking forward to my next experience. If something happens to Toby Doyle, I swear to whatever gods are out there,